Two towers, 2,977 souls, one morning that shattered the world. This is the full story.
The morning of September 11th, 2001 began as an ordinary Tuesday on the American East Coast. Commuters filled the highways and subways. Office workers settled into their cubicles in the soaring towers of Lower Manhattan. Parents dropped children at schools. Airlines pushed back from gates at Boston Logan, Newark Liberty, and Washington Dulles. The sky over New York was a crystalline blue, what meteorologists call severe clear, a term that would acquire a terrible irony before the day was over. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew members, struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center at approximately 490 miles per hour between the 93rd and 99th floors. The impact carved a gash across 6 floors of the building, igniting tens of thousands of gallons of jet fuel and sending a fireball through the elevator shafts. Within minutes, live television cameras were trained on the burning tower, and millions of Americans watched, trying to comprehend what appeared to be a catastrophic accident. 17 minutes later, at 9:03, the world understood that this was no accident. United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767, struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center at approximately 590 miles per hour between the 77th and 85th floors. The impact was captured on live television by dozens of cameras, and the footage, a commercial airliner banking hard and disappearing into the side of a skyscraper in a blossom of orange flame, became the defining image of the 21st century. In that moment, the United States experienced something it had not felt since Pearl Harbor, the visceral, undeniable shock of an attack on its own soil, witnessed in real time by tens of millions of its citizens. The psychological impact was incalculable. The political consequences would reshape the world for decades. At 9:37, American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757, struck the western facade of the Pentagon at approximately 530 miles per hour. The impact penetrated 3 of the building's 5 concentric rings, killing all 64 people aboard the aircraft and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building. At 10:03, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at over 500 miles per hour, after passengers, who had learned of the other attacks through phone calls, attempted to overpower the 4 hijackers. All 40 passengers and crew members died. The coordinated assault killed 2,977 people in total, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in human history and the worst foreign attack on American soil since the British burned Washington in 1814.
The collapse of the Twin Towers was, for most Americans, the most traumatic visual experience of their lives. The South Tower fell first at 9:59, less than an hour after being struck. The North Tower followed at 10:28. In each case, the upper floors above the impact zone tilted slightly. Then the entire structure descended in a cascade of steel, concrete, glass, and dust that lasted approximately 10 to 12 seconds. The collapses generated enormous clouds of pulverized material that swept through the streets of Lower Manhattan, turning day into night and coating everything within a half-mile radius in a thick layer of gray-white dust. Hundreds of firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical technicians who had entered the buildings to rescue occupants were killed. 343 firefighters died that day, the greatest single-day loss of life in the history of the New York City Fire Department. At 5:20 in the afternoon, a third building collapsed. 7 World Trade Center, a 47-story skyscraper located north of the Twin Towers, had been damaged by debris from the North Tower's collapse and had been burning uncontrolled for approximately 7 hours. No one was killed in its collapse. The building had been evacuated hours earlier, but its destruction would become, in the years that followed, the single most debated piece of evidence in the entire 9/11 conspiracy theory. Building 7 was not struck by any airplane. Its collapse was not widely anticipated by the public, and to many observers, its descent looked remarkably like a controlled demolition, a straight-down implosion of the kind that professional demolition companies perform on obsolete structures. This visual impression, combined with the building's relative obscurity, would make it the truth movement's most powerful recruiting tool. The immediate political response was swift and decisive. President George W. Bush, who was visiting a second-grade classroom in Sarasota, Florida, when the attacks began, was informed by his chief of staff, Andrew Card, that a second plane had struck the South Tower. Bush remained in the classroom for approximately 7 minutes, a decision that would later be cited by conspiracy theorists as evidence of foreknowledge, though more conventional explanations involve a desire not to alarm the children or a moment of shock-induced paralysis. By evening, Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office, declaring that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed the attacks and those who harbored them. Within 24 hours, intelligence agencies had identified the 19 hijackers and linked them to al-Qaeda, the Islamist militant organization led by Osama bin Laden from his base in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
The identification of the hijackers was in itself a subject of future conspiracy theories. All 19 were named within days. 15 were citizens of Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, 1 from Lebanon. Their operational leader was Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian who had lived in Hamburg, Germany, before moving to the United States to attend flight school. The hijackers had been in the country for months or years, some taking flight training at schools in Florida and Arizona. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Pent Bomb for Pentagon and Twin Towers bombing, became the largest criminal investigation in American history, eventually involving 7,000 agents and producing tens of thousands of pages of evidence linking the 19 men to al-Qaeda's network. But for conspiracy theorists, the speed of the identification raised immediate questions. How could the FBI name all 19 hijackers within 72 hours of the attacks? How had a hijacker's passport allegedly survived the fireball that destroyed Flight 11 and been found on a street near the World Trade Center? Why had intelligence agencies failed to prevent the attacks despite multiple warnings, including a presidential daily brief delivered to Bush on August 6, 2001, titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S.?"
These questions, some legitimate, some based on misunderstandings, and some manufactured, formed the seeds of what would become the largest conspiracy theory movement of the 21st century. The official investigations followed. Congress established the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, the 9/11 Commission, which conducted the most comprehensive investigation, publishing its 585-page final report in July 2004. The National Institute of Standards and Technology conducted exhaustive forensic investigations into the building collapses, publishing detailed technical reports on the Twin Towers in 2005 and on Building 7 in 2008. The FBI's Pent Bomb investigation accumulated an enormous evidentiary record. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigated financial anomalies. Multiple congressional committees conducted their own reviews. The combined weight of these investigations represented one of the most thoroughly documented events in human history.
Yet for millions of Americans, the investigations were not answers, but provocations. The 9/11 Commission was criticized for conflicts of interest. Executive Director Philip Zelikow had close ties to the Bush administration. The Commission's final report omitted Building 7 entirely. 28 pages dealing with Saudi government connections to the hijackers were classified for 14 years. The NIST investigation refused to test for explosives in the World Trade Center debris, stating that there was no evidence to warrant such testing, a circular argument that infuriated skeptics. Each perceived omission, each unexplained anomaly, each instance of government resistance to full transparency became another brick in the wall of doubt that would eventually house the 9/11 truth movement. The morning the world broke was also the morning that millions of Americans began to believe their government had broken its most fundamental promise, the promise to tell the truth. The conspiracy theories did not wait for the dust to settle. On September 12, 2001, while fire still burned at Ground Zero, while rescue workers searched for survivors in the rubble, while the nation reeled in collective shock, the first alternative narratives were already circulating on the Internet. Early Internet forums, Usenet groups, and email chains became incubators for questions that mainstream media was not yet asking. Why did the towers collapse so completely? How could steel-framed skyscrapers fall at near free-fall speed? Why was there no military intercept of the hijacked planes? Why did the government seem so unprepared for an attack that intelligence agencies had been warning about for months? These questions, posed in the raw emotional aftermath of the attacks, would eventually coalesce into an organized movement with its own leaders, institutions, publications, and millions of adherents. The psychological conditions for conspiracy belief were nearly perfect. The attacks represented what psychologists call a high-magnitude event, an occurrence so enormous in its consequences, so dramatic in its execution, and so traumatic in its human toll, that the human mind struggles to accept a proportionate explanation. The idea that 19 men with box cutters could bring the world's most powerful nation to its knees, kill nearly 3,000 people, and fundamentally alter the course of global history seems to many people inadequate to the scale of the event. Psychologist Rob Brotherton has documented what he calls proportionality bias, the cognitive tendency to assume that big events must have big causes. A conspiracy orchestrated by the most powerful government on Earth feels proportionate to the magnitude of September 11th in a way that 19 individual attackers operating with minimal resources simply does not.
There was also the matter of precedent. The United States government had, in documented historical fact, engaged in conspiracies against its own citizens and against foreign governments. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, used to justify the Vietnam War escalation, was based on events that largely did not occur as described. The CIA's MK-Ultra program had conducted illegal mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. Operation Northwoods, a 1962 proposal by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had explicitly called for staging fake terrorist attacks on American soil to justify an invasion of Cuba. The proposal was rejected by President Kennedy, but its existence, declassified in 1997, provided conspiracy theorists with their most powerful historical argument. The American military establishment had literally proposed a false flag operation. If they proposed it once, the argument went, who could guarantee they had not eventually carried one out? The information environment of September 2001 was uniquely conducive to conspiracy theory formation. The Internet was mature enough to enable rapid dissemination of alternative narratives, but not yet developed enough to provide effective fact-checking infrastructure. There was no Wikipedia, no Snopes at scale, no algorithmic content moderation. Email forwarding was the primary viral mechanism, and forwarded emails carried an implicit endorsement from the sender, your friend, your colleague, your family member, that gave conspiracy content a trust signal it would never have achieved through mainstream media channels. The gap between the massive public demand for information and the relatively slow output of official investigations created an information vacuum that conspiracy theories rushed to fill. Within weeks, specific claims had crystallized. The most immediately compelling was the visual argument. The Twin Towers looked like they were demolished. For anyone who had seen footage of professional controlled demolitions, buildings imploding symmetrically, descending into their own footprints, surrounded by clouds of dust, the resemblance to the September 11 collapses was, at first glance, striking. This visual argument had emotional power that no technical explanation could easily overcome. It did not require expertise to evaluate. It required only eyes. And for millions of viewers, their eyes told them something was wrong with the official explanation. The question of military response, or the apparent lack thereof, was another early flashpoint. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, was responsible for monitoring and defending North American airspace. In previous incidents involving off-course or hijacked aircraft, military jets had been scrambled to intercept within minutes. Yet on September 11th, no intercepting aircraft reached any of the 4 hijacked planes before they struck their targets. The gap between the first hijacking at 7:59 and the last crash at 10:03 was 2 hours and 4 minutes. In that time, the most sophisticated air defense system in the world appeared to have failed completely. For conspiracy theorists, the simplest explanation was not incompetence, but intention. NORAD had been ordered to stand down. The passport anomaly became another founding myth of the truth movement.
According to the FBI, the passport of hijacker Satam al-Suqami was found on the streets near the World Trade Center, having apparently survived the impact, the fireball, and the collapse of the towers. For many people, this was simply impossible. If the fires were hot enough to weaken structural steel, how could a paper document survive? The passport's recovery was presented as evidence of planted evidence, a clumsy attempt by conspirators to establish the hijackers' identities through manufactured proof. Investigators explained that the passport was ejected from the aircraft on impact before the fireball and landed on the street below, an explanation consistent with the physics of high-speed impact, but emotionally unsatisfying to those already primed for suspicion. The emergence of the LIHOP versus MIHOP distinction represented an early attempt to create a taxonomy of doubt. LIHOP, let it happen on purpose, held that elements of the U.S. government had foreknowledge of the al-Qaeda plot and deliberately failed to prevent it, allowing the attacks to proceed in order to create a pretext for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that the neoconservative faction of the Bush administration had long desired. MIHOP, made it happen on purpose, went further, claiming that the government itself orchestrated the attacks, including planting explosives in the World Trade Center buildings and firing a missile at the Pentagon. LIHOP was the more moderate position, requiring only bureaucratic malice and the suppression of intelligence. MIHOP required an elaborate, large-scale physical conspiracy involving hundreds or thousands of operatives.
The distinction mattered because it determined the kind of evidence that was relevant. Lip theories focused on intelligence failures, classified documents, and the documented history of government deception. MIP theories required physical evidence, proof of explosives, proof that no plane hit the Pentagon, proof of controlled demolition. Over the next several years, both strands would develop their own evidence bases, their own expert advocates, and their own internal communities. But in the fevered weeks after September 11, the distinction was less important than the shared conviction that united both camps. The official story was incomplete, inadequate, or deliberately false. Something was being hidden, and the American people deserved the truth. The controlled demolition hypothesis is the beating heart of the 9/11 truth movement, its most technically argued claim, its most visually compelling evidence, and the issue on which the entire edifice of the conspiracy theory ultimately stands or falls. The argument is straightforward. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center did not collapse because of airplane impacts and fire. They were brought down by pre-planted explosives in a carefully planned, controlled demolition. If this claim is true, it would constitute irrefutable proof of an inside job, because only actors with extended physical access to the buildings could have planted explosives, and the decision to destroy the buildings must have been made before the attacks, meaning someone in a position of power knew what was coming. The stakes of this single question are absolute. The visual evidence is, at first encounter, genuinely compelling. Watch any footage of the Twin Towers collapses and compare it to footage of professional controlled demolitions. The similarities are striking to the untrained eye. Both show buildings descending rapidly, roughly into their own footprints, surrounded by expanding clouds of pulverized material.
Both show what appear to be sequential detonations, puffs of debris ejected horizontally from the building face below the collapsing sections, which truth movement advocates call squibs. Both produce a characteristic mushrooming dust cloud, and both result in total destruction, the conversion of massive structures into piles of rubble and clouds of fine particulate matter. For millions of viewers, the visual parallel was enough. If it looks like a demolition and it acts like a demolition, then it is a demolition.
The technical case was elaborated over the following years by a growing community of architects, engineers, and physicists who argued that fire alone could not explain the collapses. The core argument centered on the properties of structural steel. The Twin Towers were constructed with a revolutionary tube-in-tube design, a dense perimeter column system of 236 steel columns connected by steel spandrel plates surrounding a central core of 47 massive steel columns that carried the building's gravity loads. The floors were supported by lightweight steel trusses spanning the 63-foot gap between the perimeter and the core. This design created vast column-free office spaces, and critics argued a vulnerability that the designers had not fully anticipated. The official explanation, as presented by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in its 2005 report, described a sequence of events that structural engineers call progressive collapse. The airplane impact stripped fireproofing insulation from the steel trusses and columns in the impact zone, exposing the bare steel to the intense heat of burning jet fuel and office materials. While the fires did not reach temperatures sufficient to melt the steel, a point that conspiracy theorists frequently emphasize, they did reach temperatures of approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius, sufficient to reduce the yield strength of structural steel by approximately 50%. The weakened floor trusses began to sag, pulling inward on the perimeter columns. When the connections failed, the floors above the impact zone, representing tens of thousands of tons of concrete and steel, began to fall as a unit onto the floors below. Once the collapse initiated, NIST argued the outcome was inevitable. The falling mass of the upper floors exceeded the structural capacity of the floors below to arrest the descent. Each floor that was struck was destroyed almost instantaneously, adding its mass to the falling aggregate. This produced the rapid progressive collapse observed in the footage, not because explosives were detonating, but because the kinetic energy of the descending mass overwhelmed each successive floor's resistance in a fraction of a second. The apparent near free-fall speed was explained by the fact that the collapsing floors offered relatively little resistance compared to the enormous momentum of the falling upper section. The squibs, the horizontal ejections of debris, were explained as compressed air and debris being forced out of the building by the piston-like action of the descending floors.
Physicist Stephen Jones of Brigham Young University became the controlled demolition hypothesis' most prominent scientific advocate. In 2005, Jones published a paper arguing that the collapses could not be explained by fire alone, and that thermite, a mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide that burns at extremely high temperatures and can cut through steel, had been used to sever the building's structural columns. In 2009, Jones and several colleagues published a paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal claiming to have found active thermitic material, specifically nanothermite, in dust samples collected from the World Trade Center site. The paper analyzed red-gray chips found in the dust, arguing that their chemical composition and ignition behavior were consistent with engineered nanothermite rather than natural materials. The thermite hypothesis faced immediate and sustained scientific criticism. Independent researchers, including chemists and materials scientists not affiliated with the government, analyzed similar dust samples and concluded that the red-gray chips were consistent with paint primer, specifically the Laclade primer used extensively in the World Trade Center's construction, which contained iron oxide and aluminum, the same components as thermite. The journal that published Jones' nanothermite paper was a pay-to-publish open-access journal with minimal peer review. Its editor-in-chief resigned in protest after the paper's publication, calling the review process compromised. The United States Geological Survey and the independent analytical firm R.J. Lee Group both conducted extensive analyses of World Trade Center dust and found no evidence of thermite, nanothermite, or any explosive residue. The organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, founded by San Francisco architect Richard Gage in 2006, became the institutional backbone of the controlled demolition argument. AE 911 Truth gathered signatures from thousands of architects and engineers who questioned the official collapse narrative and called for a new independent investigation. The organization produced documentaries, maintained a detailed website, and organized speaking events worldwide. Their core argument was an appeal to professional authority. These were not cranks or amateurs, but credentialed professionals who believed, based on their technical expertise, that the collapses could not be explained without controlled demolition.
Critics noted several problems with this appeal to authority. The vast majority of structural engineers, fire protection engineers, and demolition professionals, the specialists most qualified to evaluate the claims, supported the NIST findings. The AE 911 Truth signatories included many architects and engineers whose specialties were unrelated to structural engineering or building collapse, software engineers, landscape architects, electrical engineers. The organization's petition represented a tiny fraction of the total number of licensed architects and engineers in the United States, and the fundamental claim that the buildings were secretly wired with explosives without anyone noticing raised logistical questions that no proponent had satisfactorily answered. The logistics problem was and remains the controlled demolition hypothesis' most devastating weakness. Controlled demolition of a large building typically requires weeks of preparation, structural analysis, removal of non-structural elements, drilling of hundreds or thousands of holes in concrete and steel columns, precise placement of explosive charges, wiring of detonation circuits, and extensive testing. The World Trade Center towers were occupied by approximately 50,000 workers during business hours and visited by tens of thousands more daily. Security was provided by multiple overlapping systems, including cameras, guards, and electronic access controls. No witness among the thousands of people who worked in or regularly visited the buildings reported any activity consistent with demolition preparation. No demolition professional has been able to propose a plausible scenario for secretly wiring the buildings without detection. If the Twin Towers are the emotional core of the 9/11 conspiracy theory, Building 7 is its intellectual fortress. 7 World Trade Center, a 47-story steel-framed skyscraper completed in 1987, located north of the main World Trade Center complex, collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, approximately 7 hours after the North Tower fell. No airplane struck Building 7. No one was killed in its collapse. And yet this building, more than any other single piece of evidence, has sustained the 9/11 truth movement for over 2 decades. When confronted with debolting of the Twin Tower claims, truthers invariably respond with 3 words that have become the movement's unofficial motto: "What about Building 7?"
The visual evidence of Building 7's collapse is, even to neutral observers, genuinely striking. The building descended almost perfectly symmetrically, its roofline remaining largely level throughout the collapse. It fell in approximately 6.5 seconds, and for approximately 2.25 seconds of that descent, according to NIST's own analysis, the building experienced free fall acceleration, meaning it fell at the rate of gravity with no measurable structural resistance. This is the single most technically significant concession in the entire 9/11 investigation, because free fall acceleration implies the simultaneous failure of all structural support across the building's width, exactly what occurs in a controlled demolition, where charges are detonated to remove all columns at once. The circumstances surrounding Building 7's collapse raised additional questions. The building housed offices of the CIA, the Secret Service, the Department of Defense, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, agencies whose records, conspiracists argued, someone might have wanted destroyed. The SEC offices contained files related to numerous ongoing financial investigations, including cases involving Enron and WorldCom. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's Emergency Command Center, controversially located on the 23rd floor of Building 7 despite the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was also destroyed. For conspiracy theorists, the building's tenant list was not coincidental, but motivational. These were the records that powerful people needed eliminated. The BBC incident added fuel to the fire. At approximately 4:54 in the afternoon on September 11th, about 26 minutes before Building 7 actually collapsed, BBC World News reporter Jane Stanley reported that the building had already fallen, while it was clearly still standing in the frame behind her. The BBC later explained that its reporters had been working with confused and fragmentary wire service reports that incorrectly stated the building had collapsed, and that the premature report was a mundane journalistic error made in the chaos of the day. But for conspiracy theorists, the BBC report was evidence that someone had distributed the script of Building 7's demolition in advance, and that the BBC had jumped the gun by reading the announcement before the building was actually brought down.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology published its final report on Building 7 in November 2008. 7 years after the event and 3 years after its reports on the Twin Towers. The delay itself fueled suspicion. NIST's conclusion was that Building 7's collapse was caused by fires on multiple floors, fueled by ordinary office furnishings that burned uncontrolled for approximately 7 hours after debris from the North Tower's collapse ignited them and damaged the building's southern facade. The critical failure mechanism, according to NIST, was the thermal expansion of a floor beam on the 13th floor, which pushed a girder off its seat on column 79, a critical interior column. The loss of this column triggered a progressive cascade of failures that eventually caused the entire building to collapse. NIST's report was immediately controversial, even among some who did not subscribe to conspiracy theories. The agency initially denied that Building 7 had experienced freefall acceleration, claiming it had fallen 40% slower than freefall. When independent researchers, including high school physics teacher David Chandler, demonstrated through video analysis that the building had indeed entered freefall for approximately 2¼ seconds, NIST revised its analysis to acknowledge this fact. The revision was seen by critics as evidence that NIST had been forced to correct a deliberate misrepresentation, though NIST stated it was a clarification of its methodology. The acknowledgement of free fall remains the most technically significant victory of the truth movement. In 2019, a research team at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, led by engineering professor J. Leroy Halsey, published a draft report funded by Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth that challenged NIST's findings on Building 7. The Halsey study used finite element modeling to simulate the building's collapse and concluded that the simultaneous failure of every column in the building was necessary to produce the observed behavior, concluding that fires alone could not have caused the collapse. The study was controversial. It was funded by an advocacy organization, had not undergone the rigorous independent peer review that NIST's reports had, and its models made assumptions that other structural engineers questioned. Nevertheless, it represented the first academic-level challenge to the official Building 7 narrative. The Building 7 debate illuminates a fundamental challenge in evaluating conspiracy theories, the difference between unexplained and unexplainable. There are genuinely unresolved questions about Building 7, questions about the precise mechanism of Column 79's failure, about the adequacy of NIST's fire modeling, about why the building's collapse was so symmetrical if it was initiated by an asymmetric failure on one side. These are legitimate engineering questions that merit continued investigation. But the truth movement's argument requires a leap from these questions to a specific conclusion, controlled demolition, that introduces its own set of far more difficult questions. Who planted the explosives? How were they installed without detection? And why has no participant ever come forward? Building 7 remains the conspiracy theory's most effective recruitment tool, precisely because it occupies this zone of genuine ambiguity. Unlike the Twin Tower collapses, which have been exhaustively studied and which most structural engineers consider well explained by fire-induced progressive collapse, Building 7's collapse involves mechanisms that are less intuitively obvious, that took NIST 7 years to analyze, and that produced the result, a correction under public pressure that undermined confidence in the investigation's objectivity. For the truth movement, Building 7 is the crack in the wall through which all doubt enters. For mainstream engineers, it is a complex but ultimately explicable structural failure that happened to look suspicious. The gap between these interpretations has not closed in over 2 decades, and there is little reason to believe it ever will. The Pentagon attack generated the second most enduring claim of the 9/11 truth movement, that American Airlines Flight 77 did not strike the Pentagon on the morning of September 11th. Instead, according to various versions of the theory, the building was hit by a cruise missile, a smaller military aircraft, a drone, or a Global Hawk unmanned aerial vehicle. The commercial airliner and its 64 occupants in this narrative were disposed of elsewhere, crashed into the ocean, landed at a secret military base, or simply vanished from history. The theory was popularized internationally by French author Thierry Masson, whose 2002 book The Big Lie became a bestseller in France, and it remains one of the most widely believed individual claims within the broader 9/11 conspiracy framework.
The theory's appeal rested primarily on photographic evidence, or rather, on the apparent absence of evidence. Early photographs of the Pentagon's damaged facade showed a hole that appeared to many observers too small for a Boeing 757 to have made. Where were the wings? Where was the tail section? Where was the massive amount of aluminum, steel, and other aircraft debris that should have been scattered across the Pentagon's lawn? The first images released to the public showed relatively modest damage to the building's exterior, a punch-through hole of approximately 75 feet wide and a partially collapsed facade section, surrounded by a remarkably intact lawn with no obvious aircraft wreckage. For conspiracy theorists, the photographs told a simple story. Whatever hit the Pentagon, it was not a large commercial aircraft. The flight path added another layer of suspicion. Flight 77's approach to the Pentagon required a complex descending spiral turn, a 330-degree clockwise spiral, losing approximately 7,000 feet of altitude while banking at high speed, followed by a nearly ground-level approach across a highway and into the building's western face. This maneuver was performed by Hani Hanjour, a Saudi national whose flight instructors had described him as a poor pilot who struggled with basic Cessna aircraft. The idea that Hanjour could execute a complex maneuver that experienced commercial pilots described as extremely difficult at 530 miles per hour at ground level with no margin for error struck many observers as implausible. Some professional pilots argued that the maneuver was possible, but required skill levels far beyond what Hanjour had demonstrated. The surveillance evidence was another point of contention.
The Pentagon, one of the most surveilled buildings in the world, was surrounded by security cameras, yet the only footage released to the public came from a single security camera at a parking lot checkpoint, and it showed only a blurred white streak in a single frame, followed by an explosion, nothing that could clearly be identified as a Boeing 757. The government confiscated surveillance tapes from nearby businesses, including a gas station and a hotel with cameras potentially aimed at the Pentagon, and for years refused to release them, citing the ongoing investigation and pending trial of Zacarias Moussaoui. When additional footage was eventually released in 2006, it showed essentially the same blurred image from a slightly different angle. For conspiracy theorists, the withholding of clear surveillance footage was itself evidence of a cover-up.
The counter-evidence, however, was overwhelming, and it began with the witnesses. Over 130 people provided eyewitness accounts of seeing a large commercial aircraft approach and strike the Pentagon. These witnesses included Pentagon employees, motorists on nearby highways, airport workers at Reagan National Airport, and military personnel. Many described seeing the American Airlines livery on the aircraft. Several reported that the plane was so low it knocked over light poles as it approached the building. The light poles themselves, 5 highway light poles knocked down in sequence along the flight path, provided physical evidence of a large aircraft's approach trajectory consistent with Flight 77's radar track. Inside the Pentagon, the physical evidence was extensive and unambiguous. Aircraft debris was scattered throughout the damaged areas, including portions of the fuselage, engine components, landing gear, tires, and sections of the cockpit. The aircraft's 2 black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, were recovered from the wreckage. The remains of all 64 people aboard Flight 77 were identified through DNA analysis at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, a process that required matching recovered biological material to reference samples provided by the victims' families. The identification of each victim placed that person at the Pentagon crash site, not at some alternate location. The apparent smallness of the entry hole was explained by the Pentagon's unique construction. The building had recently undergone a major renovation of its western wedge, which included blast-resistant windows, Kevlar-reinforced walls, and a continuous steel-reinforced concrete structure designed to withstand bomb attacks. When Flight 77 struck at 530 miles per hour, the aircraft's relatively fragile aluminum wings and tail section shattered on impact against the hardened facade, while the denser fuselage, engines, and landing gear punched through. This is consistent with crash dynamics observed in other high-speed aircraft impacts against reinforced structures. The wings do not punch clean holes, but fragment and disperse along the building's face.
The Honey Hanjour question, how a poor pilot executed a complex maneuver, also had an answer, though one that satisfied skeptics less completely. While Hanjour's flight instructors described him as below average, he did hold a valid Federal Aviation Administration commercial pilot certificate and had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time. The descending spiral approach, while difficult, did not require the precision of a normal landing. Hanjour did not need to land the aircraft, only to aim it at a large building. The flight data recorder showed multiple course corrections during the approach, consistent with a pilot fighting to maintain control rather than executing a precision maneuver. And the approach path, while unusual, may have been chosen specifically because it targeted the Pentagon's recently renovated and least populated wedge, a choice that, ironically, minimized casualties. The Pentagon missile theory ultimately fails not because every question has been answered to every skeptic's satisfaction, but because the positive evidence for a commercial aircraft impact is so extensive that no alternative explanation can account for it. The eyewitnesses, the aircraft debris, the DNA identifications, the flight data recorder, the radar tracks, the air traffic control recordings, the knockdown light poles, and the matching passenger manifests collectively constitute an evidence base that no missile theory, drone theory, or global hawk theory has ever attempted to comprehensively address. The Pentagon conspiracy theory survives not on its evidence, but on the power of photographic ambiguity, on the fact that early photographs, taken before the facade section collapsed outward, showed damage that looked wrong to untrained eyes. In the conspiracy theory economy, a single compelling photograph outweighs a mountain of physical evidence. Every great conspiracy theory eventually arrives at the same question: who profits? The 9/11 truth movement found its financial smoking gun in an anomaly that was detected almost immediately: unusual trading activity in the stock market in the days before the attacks. Between September 6th and September 10th, 2001, there was a dramatic spike in put options, financial instruments that increase in value when a stock's price falls, on the shares of American Airlines and United Airlines, the two carriers whose planes were hijacked. The volume of put options on American Airlines was 6 times the normal daily average. On United Airlines, it was 4 times the average. For conspiracy theorists, the conclusion was obvious. Someone with foreknowledge of the attacks had bet against the airlines, positioning themselves to profit from the catastrophe that they knew was coming.
The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an immediate investigation into the suspicious trading. The SEC's findings, released in 2004, were less dramatic than the conspiracy theory suggested. The unusual put option activity on American Airlines was traced largely to a single institutional investor, a U.S.-based options trading newsletter that had recommended bearish positions on the airline sector based on publicly available information about the struggling industry. The put options on United Airlines were similarly traced to specific institutional investors whose trading strategies had no connection to foreknowledge of terrorism. The SEC concluded that all of the unusual trading activity had innocent explanations and that none of the traders had connections to Al-Qaeda or any intelligence agency. Conspiracy theorists were unsatisfied with the SEC's conclusions. They argued that the investigation was incomplete, that the SEC had not disclosed the identities of all traders involved, and that the agency, a government body, could not be trusted to honestly investigate the government's own foreknowledge. The fact that the SEC destroyed its investigative records in 2010 as part of a routine document disposition program was seized upon as evidence of deliberate destruction of evidence. The financial anomaly, regardless of the SEC's findings, remained a fixture of truth movement presentations and documentaries for decades. The insurance dimension added another layer to the financial narrative. Larry Silverstein, a New York real estate developer, had acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex just 7 weeks before September 11th in a deal worth $3.22 billion. The lease included insurance coverage against terrorist attacks. After the destruction of the Twin Towers, Silverstein argued in court that the 2 airplane strikes constituted 2 separate occurrences under his insurance policy, which would entitle him to twice the policy amount, approximately $7 billion. After lengthy litigation, courts awarded him $4.55 billion.
For conspiracy theorists, the timing of Silverstein's acquisition and his insurance strategy constituted evidence of foreknowledge, if not outright participation in planning the attacks.
The Silverstein case was further inflamed by a statement he made in a 2002 PBS documentary about Building 7. When asked about the building's collapse, Silverstein said, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it." And they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. The phrase "pull it" was immediately interpreted by conspiracy theorists as demolition industry jargon for initiating a controlled demolition. Silverstein's office later clarified that he meant pull the firefighting operation, withdraw the firefighters, not demolish the building. But the ambiguous phrasing became one of the most widely circulated sound bites in the truth movement's arsenal. The broader political economy of September 11th provided the motive that financial anomalies alone could not establish. The Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank whose members included future Vice President Dick Cheney, future Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and future Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, had published a document in September 2000 titled Rebuilding America's Defenses. The document outlined an ambitious plan for American military dominance, including regime change in Iraq, but acknowledged that the transformation they envisioned would be slow, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. When that catalyzing event arrived 1 year later, and when the Bush administration used it to justify precisely the military actions PNAC had proposed, conspiracy theorists saw not coincidence, but causation. The Iraq War connection became the most politically potent strand of the 9/11 conspiracy theory. The Bush administration's case for invading Iraq in 2003 was built substantially on claims that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and maintained operational ties to al-Qaeda, both claims that were subsequently proven false. The absence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, confirmed by the CIA's own Dulfer report in 2004, devastated public trust in the government's truthfulness about national security matters. If the government had lied about WMDs to justify a war, the reasoning went, what else might it have lied about? The Iraq War did not create the 9/11 conspiracy theory, but it provided it with its most powerful argument, proof that the U.S. government was willing to deceive its own citizens to justify military action.
The financial thread of the 9/11 conspiracy theory illustrates a broader pattern in conspiracy thinking, the confusion of motive with evidence. It is demonstrably true that certain individuals and institutions profited from the September 11th attacks. It is true that the attacks enabled military and surveillance policies that powerful actors had been advocating before they occurred. It is true that the government subsequently lied about matters directly related to the attack's aftermath. But the existence of motive and opportunity does not constitute evidence of planning or execution. Millions of investors profited from market movements following the attacks. That does not make them conspirators. Policies that were advocated before September 11th were implemented afterward. That does not mean the attacks were staged to enable them. The deeper lesson of the financial conspiracy theories is about the nature of coincidence in complex systems. In a global economy involving billions of daily transactions, statistical anomalies occur constantly. Put option volumes fluctuate, insurance policies are purchased, think tanks publish policy recommendations.
When a catastrophic event occurs, retroactive analysis will always find coincidences that appear meaningful because the human mind is wired to find meaning in patterns, especially after trauma. The 9/11 truth movement was not a spontaneous eruption of doubt. It was built deliberately and systematically by a relatively small number of dedicated individuals who invested years of effort in creating the intellectual infrastructure, media content, organizational structures, and public events that transformed scattered skepticism into a coherent social movement. The movement's growth trajectory followed a pattern common to successful alternative knowledge communities: an initial period of online incubation, followed by the production of compelling media that reached a mass audience, followed by the creation of formal organizations that gave the movement institutional permanence and the appearance of professional credibility.
The breakthrough moment came in 2005 when a 21-year-old filmmaker named Dylan Avery released Loose Change, a low-budget documentary that synthesized the major claims of the truth movement into a fast-paced, visually compelling 90-minute film. Avery had begun the project as a fictional screenplay about friends who discover the government was behind the attacks. But as his research progressed, he became convinced the conspiracy was real and converted the project into a documentary. The film was distributed primarily through the internet. This was before YouTube existed, and it spread with extraordinary speed through file-sharing networks, email, and online forums. Multiple updated versions were released between 2005 and 2009, eventually reaching an estimated 100 million viewers worldwide, making it one of the most watched documentaries in internet history. Loose Change was effective not because it was accurate. Virtually every specific factual claim in the film has been debunked, but because it was emotionally and cinematically compelling. It moved quickly, used dramatic music and editing, presented complex technical claims in accessible language, and appealed simultaneously to patriotism and anti-establishment sentiment. It gave viewers the exhilarating sense of being let in on a secret, of seeing through the matrix of official deception to the truth that powerful forces were desperate to suppress. The psychological reward of feeling like an insider, a truth seeker, a person brave enough to question what everyone else accepted, was far more powerful than any technical argument. The institutional phase of the movement began in 2006 with the founding of several organizations that gave the 9/11 conspiracy theory a veneer of professional respectability. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, founded by Richard Gage, collected signatures from credentialed professionals. Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice, founded by physicist Stephen Jones, provided an academic platform. Pilots for 9/11 Truth assembled commercial and military pilots who questioned the official flight paths. These organizations held conferences, published papers and documentaries, maintained websites, and conducted speaking tours. They transformed the 9/11 conspiracy theory from an internet phenomenon into something that resembled an academic discipline, complete with its own journals, conferences, and professional associations.
The movement's key figures spanned an unusual demographic range. Richard Gage, a working architect with decades of professional experience, brought credibility and respectability. Stephen Jones, a tenured physics professor at a major university, brought scientific authority, though his involvement eventually cost him his position at Brigham Young University, which placed him on paid leave in 2006 and from which he subsequently retired. David Ray Griffin, a theologian and philosopher at the Claremont School of Theology, provided the movement with its most comprehensive and intellectually rigorous published works, including The New Pearl Harbor and several subsequent books.
Alex Jones, no relation to Stephen, brought the conspiracy theory to a mass audience through his radio show and website, InfoWars, though his bombastic style and promotion of numerous other conspiracy theories made him a controversial figure even within the truth movement. The movement achieved significant penetration of public opinion. A 2006 Scripps Howard poll found that 36% of Americans believed it was very likely or somewhat likely that federal officials either participated in the attacks on September 11th or took no action to stop them because they wanted the United States to go to war in the Middle East. A 2007 Zogby poll found that 51% of Americans wanted Congress to investigate Bush administration officials for possible foreknowledge of the attacks. These numbers represented tens of millions of Americans who, to varying degrees, doubted the official account, a remarkable achievement for a movement operating entirely outside mainstream media and institutional support. The debunking effort was equally systematic. Popular Mechanics magazine published a major 2005 cover story titled Debunking the 9/11 Myths, which engaged every major conspiracy claim with detailed expert analysis. The article was expanded into a book in 2006. The National Geographic Channel produced a documentary. Multiple websites dedicated to debunking, including the JREF Forum and 9/11 Myths, maintained detailed responses to every claim. Structural engineers, demolition experts, pilots, and physicists produced technical papers and public statements supporting the official findings. The debunking effort was comprehensive, well-sourced, and technically rigorous, and it barely dented public belief in the conspiracy theory.
The movement's internal dynamics were characterized by the same factional disputes that afflict most ideological communities. LIHOP advocates clashed with MIHOP advocates over the scope of the alleged conspiracy. Some movement figures embraced the Pentagon missile theory, while others rejected it as an obvious distraction. The thermite camp and the directed energy weapons camp could not agree on the mechanism of demolition. Stephen Jones and Judy Wood, who proposed that directed energy weapons had been used to destroy the towers, engaged in bitter public disputes. These internal divisions weakened the movement's coherence, but paradoxically strengthened its resilience. There was always another version of the theory to retreat to when any particular claim was debunked. Perhaps the most revealing moment in the truth movement's history came not from within the movement, but from its most unexpected critic. Noam Chomsky, the MIT linguist and political philosopher who's arguably the most prominent and systematic critic of American foreign policy and government deception in the history of the American left, repeatedly and unequivocally dismissed the 9/11 conspiracy theory. Chomsky called the movement a distraction from the real crimes of the Bush administration, the Iraq War, the torture program, the surveillance state, and argued that the specific claims of controlled demolition and inside job were implausible and unsupported by evidence. His rejection stung the truth movement deeply because Chomsky was precisely the kind of anti-establishment intellectual who, by their logic, should have been their most natural ally. That he was not forced the movement to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that opposing the government and believing it orchestrated September 11th were not the same thing. The most dangerous aspect of the 9/11 conspiracy theory is not its false claims about controlled demolition or Pentagon missiles. It is the way those false claims have obscured the real failures, real cover-ups, and real institutional dysfunction that preceded and followed the attacks. Because the truth about September 11th is damning enough without any conspiracy theory.
The U.S. government did fail to prevent the attacks. Intelligence agencies did have information that, properly shared and analyzed, might have disrupted the plot. Officials did resist accountability afterward, and the administration did use the attacks to justify policies, including an unnecessary war, based on claims it knew or should have known were false. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented facts established by government investigations, congressional inquiries, and the testimony of intelligence professionals who tried to sound the alarm.
The story of the missed warnings begins years before September 11th. By the late 1990s, the CIA's Counterterrorism Center was tracking al-Qaeda operatives who would become two of the September 11th hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar. The CIA identified both men at an al-Qaeda summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, in January 2000, 20 months before the attacks. The agency knew that al-Midhar held a valid U.S. visa. It learned that al-Hazmi had traveled to the United States. Yet the CIA did not share this information with the FBI, which had domestic jurisdiction and the authority to locate, surveil, and potentially arrest the men. The two hijackers lived openly in San Diego, using their real names listed in the phone book for over a year before the attacks. The failure to share intelligence between the CIA and FBI was not an accident. It was a systemic consequence of regulations and institutional culture that had evolved to prevent intelligence agencies from engaging in domestic law enforcement, but which had the perverse effect of creating impenetrable walls between agencies that needed to cooperate. The so-called wall between intelligence gathering and criminal investigation meant that CIA analysts who knew about al-Hazmi and al-Midhar could not legally share their information with FBI criminal investigators. FBI agents who were investigating al-Qaeda in the United States could not access CIA intelligence about the same targets. The system was designed to protect civil liberties, a worthy goal, but its implementation created fatal blind spots that the September 11th plotters exploited, likely without even knowing they existed. The FBI's own internal warnings were equally prophetic and equally ignored. In July 2001, FBI agent Kenneth Williams, based in Phoenix, Arizona, sent a memo to FBI headquarters warning that an unusual number of men with possible connections to radical Islamist groups were attending U.S. flight schools. Williams recommended that headquarters compile a nationwide list of flight school students with potential terrorist ties. The Phoenix memo was received, acknowledged, and filed. No action was taken. In August 2001, FBI agent Colleen Rowley, based in Minneapolis, sought a warrant to search the computer and personal effects of Zacharias Moussaoui, a French citizen of Moroccan descent who had been arrested after flight school instructors reported his suspicious behavior. FBI headquarters blocked Rowley's warrant request, telling her she did not have sufficient evidence. Moussaoui was later identified as a would-be 20th hijacker.
The most explosive pre-attack intelligence failure was the Presidential Daily Brief of August 6, 2001. The PDB, the most classified daily intelligence summary provided to the president, was titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." The 1.5-page memo noted that al-Qaeda members had been in the United States for years, that the organization had a support structure that could aid attacks, that FBI information indicated patterns of suspicious activity consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attack, and that the FBI was conducting approximately 70 ongoing investigations related to al-Qaeda. President Bush later said he interpreted the PDB as historical analysis rather than a warning of an imminent threat, a characterization that National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice echoed in her testimony before the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission itself became a battleground over accountability. The commission was initially opposed by the Bush administration, which resisted its creation for over a year before yielding to pressure from the victims' families. Once established, the commission faced systematic obstruction. The White House restricted access to presidential daily briefs, attempted to limit the president's testimony to 1 hour with only the commission chair and vice chair present, and initially refused to allow Rice to testify publicly under oath. Executive Director Philip Zelikow had close personal and professional ties to Rice, raising questions about the investigation's independence. Vice Chair Lee Hamilton later stated that the commission was set up to fail. The classified 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission's final report became the most potent symbol of government secrecy surrounding the attacks. These pages, dealing with foreign government support for the hijackers, specifically connections between Saudi government officials and some of the 19 attackers, were classified by the Bush administration on national security grounds and remained secret for 14 years. The classification fueled intense speculation about what the pages contained and why they were being hidden. When the pages were finally declassified in 2016 under the Obama administration, they revealed that Saudi government officials, including intelligence officers and diplomatic personnel, had provided financial support, housing assistance, and other aid to some of the hijackers. The pages did not prove that the Saudi government as an institution directed or controlled the attacks, but they documented a level of Saudi official involvement that was deeply troubling and that the U.S. government had actively worked to conceal.
The Central Intelligence Agency's destruction of interrogation videotapes added another genuine scandal to the pile of suspicions. In 2005, the CIA acknowledged that it had destroyed 92 videotapes of the interrogation of al-Qaeda detainees, including Abu Zubaydah and Abd al-Rahim al-Nashiri. The tapes documented the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, that were later classified as torture by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The destruction of the tapes, which the CIA claimed was done to protect the identities of interrogators, was investigated by a special prosecutor who ultimately filed no criminal charges. For conspiracy theorists, the destruction of evidence was further proof that the government was hiding the truth about September 11th. For mainstream critics, it was proof that the government was hiding the truth about its torture program, a different scandal, but an equally serious one. The pattern of legitimate government failures, concealment, and deception created the perfect ecosystem for conspiracy theories to flourish. When a government demonstrably fails to protect its citizens, demonstrably conceals information about how and why it failed, and demonstrably uses the resulting crisis to justify policies based on false claims, the burden of trust shifts. Citizens who might otherwise dismiss conspiracy theories find themselves unable to fully trust the official account, not because they believe in controlled demolition, but because they have seen with their own eyes that the government is capable of deception at the highest levels. The line between healthy skepticism and conspiracy belief becomes dangerously thin. This is the 9/11 conspiracy theory's deepest tragedy. The real failures, the intelligence breakdowns, the Saudi connections, the obstruction of investigations, the torture program, the Iraq War lies, deserved far more public attention and democratic accountability than they received. But the truth movement,
by focusing obsessively on physical evidence of controlled demolition and Pentagon missiles, diverted energy and attention away from the documented scandals that could have been addressed through democratic processes. The most effective response to a government that fails its citizens is not to imagine a far more competent version of that government secretly orchestrating history. It is to demand accountability for the actual, documented, provable failures that really occurred.
More than 2 decades after the attacks, the 9/11 conspiracy theory shows no signs of dying. It has evolved, adapted, and regenerated in response to every debunking, every investigation, and every passage of time. New generations encounter the claims for the first time through YouTube algorithms and social media recommendations, and the emotional impact of watching a building collapse and being told it was deliberately destroyed is no less powerful for a 20-year-old in 2025 than it was for a 30-year-old in 2006. The 9/11 truth movement has become a permanent feature of American political culture, not because its specific claims have been validated, but because the conditions that created it have intensified. Trust in government, trust in media, trust in expertise, and trust in democratic institutions have all declined dramatically since 2001, creating an environment in which conspiracy theories of all kinds find increasingly fertile ground. The psychology of 9/11 conspiracy belief has been extensively studied, and the findings illuminate why the theory is so resistant to evidence-based correction. Proportionality bias, the cognitive tendency to demand that large events have proportionally large causes, makes it psychologically difficult to accept that 19 men with box cutters could produce consequences of such world historical magnitude. The government's demonstrated willingness to lie about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, to conduct warrantless surveillance of its own citizens, and to torture prisoners in secret prisons provides empirical validation for the general premise that the government is capable of large-scale deception. Conspiracy belief also serves social and identity functions. It creates a community of fellow truth seekers, provides a sense of special knowledge and intellectual superiority, and offers a coherent narrative that makes the chaos of the modern world seem comprehensible and purposeful. The mathematical impossibility of the conspiracy, however, remains the most powerful argument against it. Political scientist David Robert Grimes developed a mathematical model for estimating the probability that a conspiracy involving a given number of participants would remain secret over time. His model, published in 2016 in the journal PLOS ONE, found that a conspiracy involving 1,000 participants would have a 95% probability of being exposed within 3.5 years. A conspiracy involving the scale of operations required by the MIHOP version of the 9/11 theory, demolition teams, military officials, intelligence operatives, air traffic controllers, and the silence of every firefighter, police officer, and first responder at ground zero, would involve thousands of participants and would have been exposed almost immediately. In over 2 decades, no credible insider has come forward with specific, verifiable evidence of a conspiracy. The debunking record is equally comprehensive. Every major claim of the 9/11 truth movement has been investigated, analyzed, and refuted by qualified experts.
The controlled demolition hypothesis has been rejected by the overwhelming majority of structural engineers and demolition professionals. The thermite evidence has been explained as paint primer. The Pentagon missile theory is contradicted by hundreds of eyewitnesses, physical evidence, and DNA identification of all passengers. The NORAD stand-down theory has been explained by the 9/11 Commission's detailed timeline of communications failures. The financial anomalies have been traced to innocent causes by the SEC. Building 7's collapse has been modeled and explained by NIST's thermal expansion analysis. No individual claim has survived sustained expert scrutiny, and yet the theory persists. It persists because it is structured to be unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it is reinterpreted as disinformation planted by the conspirators. Any absence of evidence is proof of the conspiracy's effectiveness, and any person who argues against it is either a naive dupe or a paid agent of the cover-up. This unfalsifiability is not a weakness of the theory in the eyes of its adherents. It is its greatest strength, because it means the theory can never be conclusively disproven. It will always be possible to say, but what about this? And when the this is addressed, another this will take its place. The 9/11 conspiracy theory is, in this sense, not a hypothesis that can be tested, but a belief system that provides meaning, community, and identity to its adherents. The theory's persistence also reflects something genuine and important about the society that produced it. The United States in the early 21st century experienced a cascade of institutional failures that would have strained public trust in any democracy. The intelligence failures that preceded September 11, the lies that justified the Iraq War, the financial crisis of 2008 that destroyed millions of families' wealth while the responsible institutions were bailed out, the surveillance revelations of Edward Snowden, the partisan dysfunction of Congress, and the erosion of shared factual reality in an era of algorithmically curated information. In this context, the question is not why do people believe conspiracy theories, but how could they not? When institutions repeatedly fail and repeatedly lie, the rational response is skepticism. The tragedy is that conspiracy theories channel that rational skepticism into irrational conclusions.
The 9/11 conspiracy theory has also served as a gateway, a point of entry into a broader ecosystem of conspiracy belief that can lead to far more extreme and dangerous positions. Research has documented that individuals who adopt 9/11 conspiracy beliefs are significantly more likely to subsequently adopt other conspiracy theories, including anti-vaccine beliefs, New World Order narratives, QAnon, and anti-Semitic theories about Jewish control of world events. The conspiracy theory functions as a kind of cognitive pathway. Once a person accepts the premise that the most powerful government on earth secretly murdered thousands of its own citizens, the psychological barriers to accepting other, equally extreme claims are substantially lowered. This radicalization pathway has real consequences for democratic society. The families of the victims have occupied a complex and often painful position in this landscape.
Some families became active participants in the truth movement, channeling their grief into the demand for a new investigation. Others have been deeply hurt by the conspiracy theories, which they experience as a desecration of their loved ones' memories. The implication that their family members were killed not by terrorists, but by their own government, and that their grief has been exploited by a movement more interested in political narratives than in the actual human beings who died. The towers fell. The questions rose, and in the gap between what happened and what we were told, a conspiracy theory took root that may outlast us all.